SPX versus SPY versus all of the others? Why are there so many of them? Do they call it the S&P 500 because there's 500 different funds that track it? Tell me something only the real S&P 500 would know. S&P is abbreviated from Standard & Poor's, and they rebranded now because I guess they realized that having the word poor in the name doesn't really sit well for anything financial, so they just call it SP Global now. S&P Global is a financial data analytics and aggregation company. They started making market indices to track the health of the US stock market back in 1923, but the S&P 500 as we know it today didn't really exist until 1957 when they updated the index to include over 500 companies. The S&P was not made to be an investment instrument. It was created to gauge the health of the economy. It was meant to be a number that we can put on the wall and say, okay, look, number go up, number go down, market good, market bad. It was never made to be invested in. The S&P 500 itself is almost like a recipe. It has different constraints for what allows a company to be added and what makes a company get taken out of the index, as well as what proportions. We call it a market cap weighted index, which basically just means that the biggest companies get more weight in the index. So Apple's going to be 8%, Microsoft is 6%, and so on and so forth. Smaller companies get a smaller percent. In the 80s and 90s, mutual funds rose to popularity because it was an easy way for normal people to give their money to Wall Street suits and say, okay, smart person, not so smart person, can you manage my money please and get me a decent return? And that's how most normal people got exposure to the financial markets. As time went on, mutual funds got progressively more expensive, higher in fees, and worse in performance. And it made people start saying, well, the S&P is up 10% this year, and my stupid mutual fund is only up 6%. And of that, 1.5% got eaten up by fees. I wish I could just invest in the S&P without having to do all the work. So this was the genesis for the idea of an index fund. It's been around for a while, but it really accelerated in popularity in the 2000s and 2010s. The idea caught on because it was cheap, easy, and it worked. It was a simple way for ordinary people to get the job done in an efficient manner. So herein lies the difference. This is the first distinction I'm going to make between an index and an index fund. SPX is the index, but you can't invest in an index. You need a fund to invest in the index, hence the name index fund. So index fund just refers to the strategy of investing. If you had a brokerage account at Fidelity and you took all your money, if you had $100 and you bought $8 worth of Apple, $6 worth of Microsoft and Amazon and so on, in the correct proportions, that $100 portfolio of yours would technically be an index fund that tracks an index. Nobody would be able to invest in it, but it would technically be that. And you'd have to go in and rebalance it every quarter and make sure that you add the companies that get added and take away the ones that get kicked out. An index fund is a pooled investment that does that for you. You don't have to go in there and buy and sell everything because they do it. You just give them $100 and they say, okay, thanks. I'm going to track the S&P 500 index with this. You can buy an index fund with the vehicle either being an ETF, exchange-traded fund, or through a mutual fund. There's slight differences and nuances between those. There's some minor tax advantages to holding it in an ETF, but that's probably its own video. Typically, 5-letter tickers are mutual funds, so FXAIX, Fidelity's, well, they call it the Fidelity 500 fund. They're too cheap to pay for the brand name of S&P, so it's not the Fidelity S&P 500 index fund. It's the Fidelity 500 fund. Maybe they call it an index fund, but it's basically the same thing. They follow the same rules. Minor differences. Everybody knows it's the S&P. The one difference that is going to matter between them is the expense ratio, which is basically how much the fund managers take as a percentage of your investment in order to pay themselves for managing the fund. For FXAIX, for example, it's the lowest out of all of these at 1.5 basis points or 0.015%. I had to do some doctorate level math there real quick. So that's about as cheap as it gets, right? For every $100 that you put in, you're going to get charged 1.5 cents per year. Who cares, right? Moving on to the next one, SPY. This one's interesting because it is the most popular fund in the world to track the S&P 500. Not only that, but it's the most traded ticker in all of the United States stock market. It's also the oldest ETF in the United States, the first one to be listed on an exchange, first American ETF to be listed on an international exchange. So it's got a fair amount of clout associated with it, I guess, which is interesting because to me that's not worth paying 3 times the fees, but who am I to tell people what to do with their money, I suppose? It's my job. The expense ratio on SPY is 9 basis points, so 0.09%. Every $100 you get charged 9 cents per year. The official name for this fund, which I think is just hilarious, is Standard & Poor's Depository Receipts Standard & Poor's 500 Exchange Traded Fund Trust. I'm not joking at all. The first part is an acronym. It stands for Standard & Poor's Depository Receipts. Granted, I'm not the most well-versed in the subject, but I was kind of laughing because when I was looking this up, and it's like, okay, is this a depository receipt? No. Was it ever a depository receipt? No. Why do they call it depository receipts? All I could find is because people would associate the word depository receipts with a concept that they already know. I was like, nobody knows what a depository receipt is, but whatever. Spider's kind of a cool name, though. It's what a lot of people call it. SPDR. There's a whole fund family of spiders now, and so it's kind of become a branding thing, which I guess worked out for them in the end. But I would not have predicted that. That seemed like a really weird choice. If I didn't already say, this fund is run by State Street Global Advisors, and it's the most common way by which people get exposure to the S&P 500. VOO is Vanguard's S&P 500 index fund, and in classic Vanguard fashion, it's extremely cheap, also at 3%, 3 basis points, sorry. So it's still not as cheap as Fidelity, which is interesting, but very cheap. And then lastly, you got IVV, which is iShares, so BlackRock's index fund for the S&P 500. This one's also pretty cheap, 3 basis points, 0.03%. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, why do you use any of these funds? And the most common reason that I see people using one fund over another, by far, is the most trivial reason you can imagine. It's because their 401k only allows for one of these funds. And typically that's because the plan administrator is getting some sort of kickback by being exclusive to this one S&P 500 index fund. So if you were one of my clients and you asked me, well, Christopher, which of these S&P 500 index funds should I buy? I would say, I don't care. Buy any of them, it doesn't matter. Actually, no, I would say don't buy SPY because it's got the higher expense ratio. But also, you could make the argument that you should buy SPY because it had the second highest performance out of the four of the funds. But I suppose you could also counter that counter argument by saying the differences, the things that cause the differences in the performance between the four funds are probably not salient enough to even put into your decision making. Also, the whole past performance is no indicator of the whatever. Okay, so looking at the actual performance numbers for these four funds, well, 5 if you include the index itself. The S&P 500 itself, this is measured from July 25th, 2018 to July 25th, 2024. I wanted to get a broad range of market environments, so I just chose the last 6 years. The S&P 500 index did 90.4%. SPY did 89.57%. VOO did 89.53%. FXAIX did 89.46%, and IVV did 91.93%. So BlackRock's fund did the best out of all of them, but is that going to be true for the next 6 years? Who knows? The one that I personally use to invest is VOO. I don't know if there's a big reason to that. I don't use FXAIX because I don't like the mutual fund vehicle, and I don't use SPY because I think the expense ratio, well, I don't think it's high, honestly. 9 basis points, who cares? But it's higher than the others, and that was enough for me to not pick it. Thanks for watching Venrate on YouTube. I hope you found this video helpful and informative, and if you did, please do consider giving a like and subscribing. Don't forget to check out Venrate.com to use the world's best financial calculators and planning tools. No, that was the end. That's all I had to say. I thought there was something else. Have a good day, I guess.